Friends, to understand, to cherish, and to perceive the places we live are the most important thing we can do. Oh, to see, to hear, to touch, to smell, to taste the places we live. And recognize all of its living beings. People, animals, plants, trees, rivers, insects, flowers, bees. All of us in a relation of reciprocity and coexistence. That is the most important thing that we can do, which includes the most important theological work that we must do. I bring greetings from Brazil, the place I was born. As you all heard, Brazil is being destroyed right in front of our eyes. The agribusiness, along with the death-driven President Bolsonaro and the right-wing evangelical support, are literally killing everything. Every day in Brazil, we witness the murder of 1.5 million trees every day. Every day, and the Congress is about to pass a law that will literally devastate all indigenous lands with mining. And you know who's supporting it and who is at closed door meeting with the Brazilian government? European Union and the G20. Thank you very much. And since I was going to be there, but since I am remotely I wish I was there in Germany. I wanted to say a word of gratitude to Bayern, who is poisoning the soil of a vast majority of topsoil around the globe, to former Monsanto, who is now Bayern. My gratitude. And I also bring greetings to you from the United States, where I live, and I am also a citizen. The United States continues to fulfill its power mission abroad, saving the world from evil tyrants, even though in small countries where there's oil. The military, one of the most pollutant organizations in the world, now has the largest budget in history. And the American democracy is running fast into disappearance. Somebody said 2 election cycles and democracy is over. Today, I want to remind us of the places of constant combat, weariness, and loss of resilience, and what would mean for us to engage in those places. Home, places of so many destituted beings, displaced. I want to remind us of the Amazon, who is losing its resilience right now. And it is already showing signs of no return to its ability to self-restoration, and with the current climate disasters that we are going through. The infinite places of extraction and destruction. These are the places where we must start. The places where the composition of forces of coloniality continues full force, decomposing people, habitation, and refugia, destroying everything. So my talk today is a way of how do we find ways to resist, to figure out the places we can live, to camouflage, and through its disguise, continue to hold on to life as much as we can, for as long as we can, caring for refugia, for all of us. Let me start with an event in Brazil. What was a local action against the increase of the bus and train fare by 20 cents in São Paulo, in Brazil in June 2013, became a national manifestation of huge proportions. In the thick of the street's upheaval, a reporter asked a protester, "Who are you?" And he said, "Write that down. I am nobody." Who did this protester and the people of the streets represent? The left wing and its social revolutions, the right wing and the leftovers, what one might call the state, the political parties? Well, along with all of the proper social geopolitical analysis, This manifestation also helped us think about the ways in which we deal the notion of subject, subjectivity, bodies, psyche, and social movements. The June masks were possible because they were based on a wild emergence of a nameless class. Just like a nameless class of birds, of worms, of deers, of trees, that we couldn't care less about it. The forms of solidarity in that demonstration were less connected by an ideology of power agency than a mobilization that emerged from social exhaustion and unwavering anger. An explosion of social narratives found the streets, and at the same time the streets created the explosion of social narratives. Some commentators, based on Hannah Arendt's notion of the free action, said that it was a dispute of narratives. It was not a dispute of narratives, but an ocean of mobilizations and the spread of the occupations that followed. As in Joyce's Ulysses, we are in an infinite present. The inactuality of June is contained in June itself, since it does not exhaust the potential of the struggles in the temporal space of a month or a day. In the same way that the Bloomsday or the Bloody Sunday repeats itself from year to year, the Brazilian June repeated itself even while it was happening, less by the concept of narratives and more by the profusion of narratives. A whole temporal architecture that illustrates the clash of subjective powers within the metropolis. Perhaps in the thick of wars we are living now, we have to ask ourselves about what is the architecture that illustrates the clash of objectivity and subjectivity powers everywhere. What about the non-state actors? The civilians, called casualties, creating a massive refugee crisis of proportions yet to be fully discovered. What are we going to do with the refugees? And what do we do with the fear of nuclear wars ever more present? We have thousands of interpretations, right, of the war at this time. But from a certain theological perspective, I suggest that we must pay attention to the nobodies. Nobodies. Human and more than human. And learn how to recreate our religious discourses. Well, modernity has shaped most of what we think and relate today, right? Notions of self, power, private land, race, and so on has shaped us all. However, it was the notion of possession attached to the forms of existence that shaped us into who we have become. As Willie Jennings says, we are shaped in this binary. You either possess something, somebody, or you are possessed by something, somebody. The possession created the notion of cultivation and productivity that is now basis of progress and capitalism. Europe, United States, G20, Russia, China cannot be possessed by anyone. They can only possess everybody else. They don't have much forests anymore, so they possess somebody else's forests. They don't have oil, so they must possess somebody else's oil, or those who are in need of the oil. They supposedly don't hold slaves for production of their goodies, so they must possess all of the production of means that allow other forms of slavery. With capitalism, possession and dispossession are at the front line of abuse, use, necropolitics, forms of governments, and capitalist extraction. Patriarchy holds on to these forms of possession and dispossession, including in theology. Males with power competing everywhere, crushing people, destroying the environment, creating toys of mass destruction. This war in Ukraine now is nothing but an expected consequence of the various wars already in place. The war against women, the war against indigenous people, the war against black folks, the war against refugees, the war against immigrants, the war against Roma people, the war against the Dalits, the war against the Palestinians, the war against the children, the war against the poor, the war against the trees, the war against the rivers, the war against the animals, the war against the rivers, the wars against the oceans, the war against the earth. They are all unrepresented and dispossessed subjects of war left aside by large geopolitical analysis. They live bare lives, volatile and strong as the width of their breath. But who can breathe in this time? In some ways, the nobodies are losing their abilities to breathe more immediately. As the earth is also losing its ability to breathe. And if the forest doesn't breathe, we cannot breathe either. So the question here for us perhaps can be, Steve, what question, what can these subalterns speak? But then we should shift then, and perhaps the most important question here is, who can breathe today? Breath has to do with habitation. Breath has to do with place, with forms of living with other beings. COVID brought that sense of breath very strongly to us. But we don't pay attention to breathe, do we? I'd say our senses of perceiving are compromised, which means that our bodies, the natural body, the political body, are all compromised, including the church. Well, the church, to cite Althusser, has become an apparatus of the state. And the state only pays attention to some people's breath. What is now happening within our Christian churches and seminaries has been written on the wall since Constantine. Cooptation by incorporation, coloniality, capitalism, patriarchy, racism, and so on. Our theological systems of thinking worked with a horizon of possibilities that never considered dismantling those structures of powers. And we are now choking. In the United States, churches still connect life with budgets and endowments. The mission of the church depends on its investment in the market that serves capitalism, that is in own terms is crushing all of the unproductive churches that do not grow. It is not the secular age that is killing churches. The concentration of money within these churches is what is making the small congregations disappear. Well, roughly speaking, it's like big corporations equals rich churches. Local business equals poorer churches. Whomever can feed the market will survive. Opportunity for all. God for some. Here in Europe, the relation of church and state, and thus capitalism, shows where the church's commitments are as well. Capitalism orients states and churches as how to live. For way too long, churches have been the apparatus of capitalism, and that relation ordains the very limits and possibilities of its agency and forms of solidarity. It is the logic of belonging between church, state, and capitalism that stunts notions of solidarity. We are caught short by what the financial market allows us as we are gasping for air. Some of us. European churches are all marked by the ongoing colonization of their countries. All the money that Europe has now comes from the exploitation and domination. The U.S. churches are also marked by all its forms of colonization. All the money that is there is the fruit of exploitation and colonization. Rather than solidarity, what is left for us in the system is just to include. That's all we can do, is to include somebody, as many as we can. Not to undo the system, but to include in the system. Is there a way out? Well, theologists from below, liberation theologists, try to call our attention to the nobodies, the ones who could not breathe, the poor. The work of contestation against above ahistorical theology began considering the structures of life which people were living under in order to form and shape the discourses of God, right? You all know that. The major themes in each place of the world oriented the liberation theologies. As you know, culture in Africa, race in the United States, class and economic system in Latin America, the Minjung theology in Korea, the Dallas and the caste system in Palestinian theology under the siege of Israel. And along those lines, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, and Hindu liberation theology start to appear as well, from their own theological, historical perspective. the historical location and the social condition of the one suffering reoriented theology and the very notion of God. In other words, here's the point. The where of theology was fundamental. Theology shifted from the major places of the north to the south of the world. And then the question then for us should be what Hami Dabashi asks. Can the non-European think? Without proper reason, without platitudes, without too much simplicity, and with sound forms of transformation and true solidarity? Many questions of epistemology are related to this question. Questions relate to place, to relation to the ways knowledge are made and validated in their own right. For instance, the question of interreligious work. How can Christians engage with other frames of work outside of its own assumed modern structures? Argentinian theologian Santiago Slabodsky makes a very important analogy between philosophy and Europe, religion and the religious scholar. He says, if for the continental philosopher there is no possibility of thinking outside of Europe, for the colonially appointed philosopher of religion, there is no possibility of existence outside of totalizing Christian framework. One way to engage that critique is to know the trajectories and the boundaries of one thinking. A rather difficult thing to do, right? I'm not asking here for a pure knowledge for Christians, but in the words of Willie Jennings, the second readers. We are the second readers, which is to assimilate the knowledges of others in ways that we can honor other religions in their own right. So assimilation here is neither a way to take over somebody else's knowledge, nor a wishy-washy movement of we are the one, kumbaya, my God. On the contrary, it is to assimilate somebody else's knowledge, is to know one's own limits and to honor somebody else's limits and be transformed by somebody else's knowledges and frameworks. In other words, it is to engage different cosmologies as forms of living in order to create and recreate forms of solidarity, now not only as a Christian, but as somebody else. If we are to think about solidarity in interreligious frameworks, what are the conditions of knowing and understanding that frame the forms of dialogue, relation, and movement? Slabodsky goes further. The problem is not necessarily Christianity, he says, but the omnipresence of Christian normativity in discourses of dominance, rebellion, and re-existence. Thus, what makes it mean to engage forms of resistance, protest, and solidarity from somebody else's frames of knowledges and practices? Again, what are our boundaries? But also, where do we have this co-influence? I keep thinking about the Brazilian anthropophagic movement in 1922 when a bunch of intellectuals and artists used the metaphor of anthropophagism, a ritual done by indigenous people eating foreigners to strengthen themselves. It was and still is a movement of rebellion and transformation that keeps repeating itself through generations. Not the real eating, but the knowing and the devouring of somebody else's knowing in order to make oneself stronger. This movement shows us that every form of knowledge, of holding knowledge, of moving with knowledge, carries ambiguities, mutual challenges, and problems. We are never a pure and unhinged form of a discrete, proper knowledge of lineage and inheritance, are we? Rather, we are a mix of knowledges, ancestries, differences, and commonalities. So I grew up with European education in Brazil. So does that mean that the European knowledge is my own form of knowledge? I have a great-grandmother who was an indigenous shaman. Can I claim an indigenous knowledge when I cannot even prove she was indigenous because of the erasure of colonialism? Well, the mixture and fixture of all of these encounters must be reflected more clearly in the ways we do theology, so other forms of solidarity can be created. See? We must start paying attention to collective forms of knowledges that are not ours. And we need them to learn from them and to change ourselves, to become somebody else. So I wonder what it is that Christians have to eat, but also be eaten by others in order to strengthen a more collective notion of solidarity to fight against fascism, patriarchy, capitalism, and the erasure of those who are barely breathing. If we look at movements in the so-called New World, Christianity was eaten by those movements made of other religions and turned into their own forms of resistance and protest. So what methodologies to use? How to pay attention to those suffering? Where are the places we live that the sacred will sustain us in this struggle? Through multiple crossings, being affected and transformed by those who live with us, we must establish horizontal forms of solidarity where the forms of knowing are related with the land we live and what is around us. Not only humans, but also more than human beings as well. So we must go from generic forms of universal concepts and human solidarity as human rise and move close towards the multi-species belonging where we live, so we can start with this space, forms of relationality, entanglement, and mutual belonging. In that way, we could say that the notion of God's preference for the poor means that God has a preference for a variety of forms of knowledges, which entail other cosmologies, other gods, other stores of creation, other forms of being, of resistance, of making life flourish. For Christian theology, those who follow Jesus must start where it hurts, where the nobodies are. The people displaced, dispossessed, the ones who live under the radar of the police, those killed by the state, amidst the one barely breathing. Also, God's knowledge comes from the ground, from the trees, from the rivers, from the beasts, from the patterns of life, everything that forms the law of the land. These are the necessary place where we must lean towards, learn from, and be transformed. All of that means that we still need a solidarity that is yet to be created. One that is latent to us, but vivid in the forms of resistance of the displaced and mutual care of the nobodies. But where are these places? Amidst the refugees, near the animals losing their habitats, the acidic oceans, the dying coral reefs, the falling forests becoming deserted areas, those living near polluted rivers, poisoned lands, drought areas, stinking streets, urban abandoned zones, dumpster neighborhoods. It is only within those places that we have then to see, to listen, to smell, to taste, and to hear the call from them. Of what the Congolese novelist Sonny Labutansi says, so that we can reinvent everything. Concepts, approaches, habits, methods, the tools, the nations, the spaces. We must learn with those who are surviving under the radar of totalizing surveillance, forms of knowledge that are hiding under the spectrum of violence, surviving forms of insubmission and dispossession. There are three ways that the state are doing it. Brazilian Vladimir Safatli talk about what Florestan Fernandes called in Brazil the land of preventive counter-revolution. He says, to prevent counter-revolution means that the main device of power is the mobilization of the state in paralyzing a permanent insurrectionary dynamic that runs through our history of popular insubmissions. This counter-revolutions operates in three levels. First is that of direct state violence that uses police apparatus to manage forced disappearance, massacres, and the extermination of vulnerable populations. Second, it is through the symbolic erasure of insubmission and repossession. Third, it is through subjection by melancholy, by the long social and psychic work of colonization by melancholy, by the psychic or internationalization of belief in the inexorable destiny of defeat. Therefore, physical death, symbolic death, and psychic death. Against the physical, symbolic, and psychic death, everywhere we must find forms of knowledge and strategies that can help us survive and avoid full front attacks. An European Central African professor of anthropology who teaches in France, Donatien Tauan-Bona, who writes about marronage, fugitives, and refuge, says, in these dark times, in which control devices proliferate, resistance must be stealthy rather than frontal. To attack in open terrain is to offer oneself as a cannon fodder to the multiple powers that tend to subject us, to expose oneself to be captured, discredited, criminalized. It is a matter then of resisting in a minor way. In order to understand that form of resistance and create other forms of solidarity, we must lose the grip of possession and the forms of productivity and start to think in terms of relationality, mutuality, and reciprocity. Forms of resistance and solidarity must always be the creation of inhabitations, dwellings, homes for all. We have to reposition ourselves to be where the nobodies live. And see that there is a colonial wound that shapes us all and how we live. Look how tiny those trees are. All the fake trees are gone. There's a wound, colonial wound, everywhere. Bringing that colonial wound to the God's preference of the poor and the decolonial, post-colonial notion of uprootedness. We meet with the land and the poor. And in these crossings, I hope that various forms of interreligious planes of immanence and attention can grow from the ground, along with the wretched of the earth and the wretched earth, the displaced people and the abandoned land. The world has been encroached by the death of everything that lives. Rivers at every neighborhood have been polluted. Topsoil losing its strength and dying everywhere. Oceans are dying. Biomes once rich of diversity are losing its fullness. The Amazon losing its resilience to sustain us all. So many worlds within the worlds are losing its possibility of being a home to us and a refugia to other species. We are all dying. But we can't give away to the discourse that says we can't do anything anymore. We cannot. On the contrary, we must do. First, we must reframe our senses to perceive the death of the earth and the killing of the people and species. We must be with those who have been banished, uprooted, displaced, exiled, moved away, ripped apart from homes and refugia, places of care and sustenance. Those turned into vulnerable species living mostly in dead land zones. The theological call here, my friends, for every religion is we must live with the refugees, walk with the nomads, embrace the untouchables, move around cities with the Roma people, sleeping with the homeless, the ones trying to find cheaper rent, siding with the Palestinians, being with those without hospital and medical care, being with all of the land that is being exploited. In Christian terms, we must displace our churches away from the state and capitalism and start something new with other forms of thinking. One that engages the human and the non-human world equally, not to include anybody, but to destroy what we have so that we can create something else. If we don't create something else, we're all going to die. The pulsing energies of the streets, the fearful crossroads where the spirits make bargains, the faraway neighborhoods, the violent communities, the abandoned peripheries, garbage shelters where there's no toiletry, places of extraction, expulsion, places without public policies and any support from any form of state, like the homes of indigenous people where capitalism extracts not only their lands but their whole lives. These places must be where theology screams its sacred protests. It is where we learn a new grammar, where we discover multiple other planes of immanences, other gods, animisms, and forms of life. There, in those places, multiple immanences, we have to move away from the zones we know. Getting tangled with everything else. It is elsewhere that we learn a new grammar. Being lost, where we discover many planes of immanence. There is where we learn how to sing, how we honor the land, and we write different stories. Different stories. Isabel Stenger talks about ecology of practices, in which every practice has an ecology in itself, with different existing living beings in each practice world. There, in those worldly entanglements, there is a cosmopolitics that begs us to be humble, since we are arriving where something is already going on. There's already going on here for millennia. When we arrive, we have to come softly, listen, pay attention, and move according to the law of the land. When we pay attention to those who are in lines of feud, the fugitive modes and places, we realize there are many worlds around these roots and borders, already creating other forms of solidarity that are truly horizontal, opening spaces and forms of life that are vast and complex. Denethen Towan-Bona talks about marronage and forms of escape. He says, since the 16th century, on the margins of the colonies of the New World, societies of runaway slaves have emerged. Palenques and Cumbas in Hispanic America, Colombos and Mocambos in Brazil, Maroon communities in Jamaica and Florida, Campos in Guyana and Suriname. Beyond their differences, these forested communities shared a common art of escape. The refuge in the forest constitutes the matrix of their culture. Whatever the subject, slaves, refugees, vagabonds, deserters, and etc. Escape is always composed in counterpoint to the machines of capture. If it finds its most evident manifestation in the historical experience of marooning, it does not cease to be at the same time a form of universal resistance perceptible in other places and times, including the future. In these terms of escape, the maroon communities are always resisting and re-existing in these new forms and places and organizations. They have been uprooted by colonial powers that took away their relation with the land, yet they create forms of escape and life that hold the machines made to capture lost, confused, or obsolete. It is a shifting and shuffling of power, as Denethen says. To flee is not to be put to run, but on the contrary, it is to lick the real and to operate endless variations to stop all capture. Escape is creative escape. The black rebels do not escape, they run away. Masters of subterfuge even dodge, evade, disappear in a cloud of artifices, false leads, lures, stratagems, tricks of all kinds. That's how they survive. If we pay attention to the land and to the landscape, all of the land can be allies to those fleeing. Spaces for restitution of life and rootedness. Birds are to be mimicked to confuse the enemy. Rivers are routes and directions for freedom and anointing. Forests are hiding places par excellence. They offer medicine and refuge for those who know them. The quilombos in Brazil, the Underground Railroad in the United States were testimonies of those worlds of human and more than human surviving together. Those escaping forms of destruction connected with birds, river, forest, refuge along the way, creating forms of living where the enchantments of the world were vividly present. The roots of fugue are all enchanted, my friends, and the fugitive process are marked by camouflage, dismissal, trickstering, by calling the enemy into the dangerous zones of insecurity, of obscurity, where they cannot be seen properly. As Deleuze says, to hide, to camouflage oneself is a warrior function. And the line of flight attacks the enemy, transverses something and puts that what it transverses to flight. The warrior arises in an infinite of a line of flight. The camouflage, the trickstering, the mimicry works on different planes of perception to the point of hiding, even to become imperceptible. Through these flights, a whole undoing and relocation of subjectivities and places are taken into various forms of constant movement. The route of fugue are also the routes of reorganization of entire worlds, inside and outside. Through the fugue, points of rest, caution, prayer, and refuge are built. The Maroons use the religion resources from their ancestors to support and bear witness to their escape, and their gods, enchantment, orishas, spirits, where and are all are part of fugitive plans. And when they arrive to a safe place, rituals are done to balance the energies, to organize the spatialities, ground the body in the land, prepare offerings, adorn the bodies, listening to the local spirits in every tree, the chapiris. Bring the ones who travel with them and enchant the new inhabited spaces. In those places, there's no need whatsoever to make a case for God's preference for the poor. That is too much of a modern thing to do. No need to call for God's preference for the poor. This is such a modern thing. God for the poor. Because it's a given where God is. There's so many movements of resistance. Let me just mention three. The Quilombos. The Quilombos in Brazil was furtive villages where spaces of refuge were offered to everyone running away from slavery. The Quilombos were refuge for all who were excluded: former slaves, indigenous people, beggars of the city streets, abused women, colonial guards who decided to change life, and so on. Quilombos back in Africa, in Angola, meant settlement or fortress, and was the place where warriors were prepared to combat. In colonial Brazil, Quilombos were a way to fight slave owners and the whole structure of a slave society. Quilombos were also a shelter for freedom, self-determination, and the building of small societies. Quilombos were also a shelter for freedom and self-determination and the building of small societies. Each Quilombo has a strong feature, either agriculture, mercantile, mining, farmers themselves. They could plant, raise animals, exchange leftovers with other free communities. They engaged into legal and illegal commerce and were able to buy weapons to survive. Also, Quilombos were open spaces for dance, music, religions, cultures, traditions from Africa and other peoples. It was a mix of many traditions. Afro traditions mixed with Christianity and indigenous religions create what Brazil now has, the Brazilian Afro and indigenous religions. During services, constant reorganization of identity is in place. The fulgurant and powerful possessions were a form of destitution and restitution of identity forged into the elements of nature: fire, water, wind, and earth. Each orisha relating to an element, each spirit living in a different tree, plant, seed, mountain, animal. The religious rituals were as they still are powerful, transformative sources of sustenance. As Denethor says, during the ritual trance, the possessed is the deity's horse. And lands subjected to slavery, the theater of the invisible cannot fail to be subversive. During the ceremony, the condition of slave is suspended, denied, overthrown, abolished. Someone says, in going through the cycle of mystical metamorphosis, the Negre passes from slavery to the epiphany of the gods and goddesses. The face is transformed. The whole body becomes a simulacrum of the divine. And what would a deity fear? Says Denethor. Today, there are more than 3,000 organized quilombola communities throughout Brazil, where they continue to struggle to own the land, protect its biodiversity, organize schools, create forms of food security, and keep their ancestral traditions. Quilombos today are still a very strong alternative to the notion of modernity that we have and progress to our consumerist society. They still offer potent alternatives to the ongoing white-owned plantations everywhere. Underground Railroad. We also see the fugitive forms of living in the Underground Railroad in the United States. The Underground Railroad helped free 100,000 people from slavery. However, the Underground Railroad was never underground nor railroad. The names allude to the hiding forms of escape. Underground was the place where one could hide and find shelter with other creatures. The underland, a dark, scary, unknown space. A key place for hiding, planning, organizing away from the light of power surveillance. The word railroad carried the whole grammar and vocabulary of the escape in codes. The words in relations are agent, coordinator, who plotted courses of escape and made contacts. Baggage, fugitive slaves carried by the Underground Railroad workers. Bundles of wood, fugitives who were expected. Conductor, person who directs transported slaves. Drinking gourd, the Big Dipper, and the North Star. Freedom Train, the Underground Railroad. Moses, Harriet Tubman, Promised Land, Canada. In sum, the Underground Railroad was a network of people and locations, a kind of rhizome thread where connections and connectors organized the path to freedom. This network of freedom worked under inner codes so the slave owners would never have a sense of what they're talking about or where to find them. Since education to enslaved people was forbidden, so the movement of freedom had to rely on common knowledge of the people. And one of the major sources for the common knowledge was the hymnal, was songs. Songs that they sang. Follow the drinking gourd. This song was taught by a man called Pagli Joe, a conductor of the Underground Railroad. It is said that he would go from different plantations to a different plantation, teaching people how to sing. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd. For the old man is coming just to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd. The drinking gourd was the journey to freedom, a symbol for the Big Dipper, which was the sign in the sky to be navigated by during the night. The drinking gourd was the navigation to the north. And the old man was the agent waiting for them. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd. When the sun comes back and the first quail calls, follow the drinking gourd. The quail in Alabama began their mating calls at the beginning of April, and it was said that it was the time for them to leave their plantations. The Underground Road grounded its fugitive organizations around darkness, secrecy, and disguise, running through the night and resting through the day, going through rivers. The scent of their sweat and clothes disappears, and the dogs of the plantation's owners were lost in finding themselves. During the night, they would walk, looking at the Big Dipper and following the drinking gourd, the North Star. Oh, they had to be friends with the night. Surely the darkest night of the soul is something only for white people to wrestle with. Because for the enslaved people, the darkest night of the soul was the best night. Because it was the night that was the best to live, to find the path to freedom, the safest place to be. Oh, Harriet Tubman was one of the most fascinating agents of freedom during the Railroad Underground. A runaway herself, she would go back to her people to free them. Growing up as a slave, Harriet was violently hit in the head because of the a white baby that she was carrying that would not stop crying. From that time, she suffered immensely with narcolepsy and headache. However, she also developed a powerful spiritual connection. Her prayers were always answered. She knew the path to go. She followed her intuitions, was always safe. She never lost a slave person and brought them to freedom. She ran for 90 miles for a time we don't know how long. She crossed the Mason-Dixon line, a demarcation line for the legality of slavery. North of that line was the free state. She said, I had crossed the line. I was free, but there was no one to welcome me on the land of freedom. I was a stranger in a strange land, and my home after all was done in Maryland, because my father, my mother, my brothers, my sisters, my friends were there. I was free, and if I was free, they should be free too. Then she returned to rescue them. And when back, so many others would come with her. She helped them. She would arrive at the edge of plantation, get on a tree, and sing, wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. And that means that it was time to leave. The water was troubled. There was time to leave. And then they would get them and take them to the north and free them into a road of freedom. There was a reason why she was called the Moses of her own people. She was the Moses. Oh, go down, Moses. Way down into Egypt's land, tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. But not only the Columbus or Underground Railroad movement, the night is also a place for the Latinx culture, the Latino-Latina culture. The night is a hiding place for excellence. For this community, people whose identities cannot flourish during the day, they found refuge at night. Queer people inhabited the night as a site of belonging and fullness. The night as the shadow of the day, but also a place where all of the displaced people could inhabit and find its own light, own social affirmation and social belonging. The night turns the other into a participant of places forbidden during the day. As Maria de Guzman says, Latino-Latina figurations of night have constituted an aesthetics of self-representation as well as a form of resistance to compulsory state-sanctioned definitions of Latino-Latina identities. Tropes on night are composed of multiple devices in terms of power, cultural identity, social temporal maps of affliction. The invocation of the night is a place where concepts are blurred. The forms of modern rationality loses its impulse of immediate meaning and have to ponder about inversions, reorientation, and assumptions of life, and is expected as a cultural normalcy. No wonder Latin American literature created the magical realism, which were epistemologies that challenged assumptions of rational liberal humanism born of Enlightenment's radiance. The unreasonable, the obscure, the ungraspable are all inhabitants of the night, in monsters, undefined figures, half humans, half spirits, half animals, had parents, with different notions of time, with different notions of spatiality. The night is the place that is and never is there. The night is the time to share the stories hidden in the surveillance of the day. The night is where bodies are fully attended, where the vulnerable provide vigil for each other. The night is the place where the wretched of the earth can say its prayers, enchantments, and make their offerings. It is in the night that they hide and sing. It is the crossroads where many possible crossroads of knowledges collapse and emerge, telling forgotten old histories and create new ones. The aesthetics of the night is less of a production, is less a means of production and more a production of means, a way of creating conditions of possibilities for life to be sustained, to be possible, to be lived. The night intensifies life and gives to it its full splendor. I take from the strategies of Hugh that Christianity also needs to develop an affection and an intimacy with darkness. We are too much light. We like too much light. We need to be friends with the night, my friend. With the night. We need more Lent. The places where the refugees, the undesirable, the wretched of the earth lives in the wretched earth, who's also been destroyed. Our rituals of Lent are embedded in the night, the earth, death and dying might lead the way. And finally, my friends, laughter. We must learn to laugh or disasters will dismantle us. We will be too crazy. We should learn with the indigenous people who are able to laugh after centuries of genocide. Hold on the night. Hold on to what is serious, but playful. Because those who live in the night, they know how to laugh, how to dance. The people who are fugitives, they know how to sing. They know how to sing, how to pray. And we have to add to our theologies the possibility of laughter. We must learn to laugh. We should learn with the indigenous people who are able to laugh after centuries of genocide. There is a sacred clown from the indigenous people called Craôs in Tocantins. His name is Hochua. The sacred clown job is to play, to surprise, to subvert the rules. He's responsible for the harmony and the balance of the village. The Craôs are people of the laughter. But tell me, how can they laugh when their worlds are crumbling down? When they have to resist the destruction of the river that keeps them alive, with more than 30 dams approved by the Brazilian government. The Craôs organize their lives around three aspects of life: the harmony of nature, the strength of plants, and the celebration of life. The Hochua helps to ensure cultural resistance, even in the midst of death, genocide, and epidemics. Woo. For the Native Americans in the United States, the sacred clown's name is Heyoka, a special shaman known as the Holy Jester, with healing powers through laughter. Heyoka belongs to the Sioux, Lakota and Dakota people of the Great Plains of North America. The Heyoka is visited by a great thunder beings, which are birds of supernatural being of great power and strength. The Heyoka confuses people by doing things backwards, like hiding horses backwards, speaking backwards, standing upside down, wearing their clothes inside out. Oh, he complains about things that are important and celebrate. And they celebrate when they are struggling, like saying how he is full when people have nothing to eat. Principally, the Heyoka functions both as a mirror and as a teacher, using extreme behaviors to mirror others and forcing them to examine their own doubts, fears, hatreds, and weaknesses. Heyoka have the power to heal emotional pain. Such power comes from the experience of shame. They sing of shameful events in their own lives. They beg for food. They live as clowns. They provoke laughter in distressing situation of despair. They provoke fear and chaos when people feel too complacent and overtly secure to keep them from taking themselves too seriously or believing they are more powerful than they actually are. The clown is to engage in a spiritual path, one that needs wisdom to know how to act and engage rituals in other beings. The coyote is a symbol of the trickster, confusing people with moves and sounds. The coyotes go around. The analysis of the ways in which native authors humorously and imaginatively transform degrading images, colonial paradigms, and essentialist ideas shows humor to be an amusing and highly effective tool for reclaiming native representational sovereignty and an indispensable strategy for negotiating native identity, says Eva Gruber. Can you hear it? When the clown makes his jokes, the earth laughs and the sound goes on and the earth laughs. Concluding, my friends, we are losing all of our world. Not only the Maroons, the Africans, the indigenous people, all the human and more than human species. We need to create lines of escape for people, for animals, for forests, for biomes, for water. As Deleuze said about the lines of flight, one, on the line of escape, there can be only one thing: life experimentation. Only when a flow is deterritorialized, can it conjugate with other flows, which in turn deterritorialize it, and vice versa. In becoming animal, a man and an animal are conjugated, neither of them resembling the other, neither imitating the other, each one deterritorializing the other and carrying the line further. The escape line is the creator of this becoming. The great geographical adventures in history, he says, are escape lines. That is, long walks, on foot, on horseback, or by boat. That of the Hebrews in the desert, that of the Genseric, the Vandal crossing the Mediterranean, that of the nomads across the steppe, the long walk of the Chinese. It is always on the line of escape that one creates, not of course because one imagines or dreams, but on the contrary because something real is traced, and a plane of consistency is composed, fleeing, but running away, looking for a weapon. Ooh, how can we create those lines of escape? Life experimentation, looking for the weapon, proper weapon for survival. To engage in those lines of escape is to go underground, underland, and learn anew how to disguise, to run away, to trickster, to compose, to opposite directions, to sing with the earth, to create quilombos for the wretched of the earth, to laugh in the face of death, to become clowns for the sake of the earth. These are the ways to learn about sacred protests, my friends, but they are also ways of creating forms of mutual belonging, dwellings for all, homes for a vast array of people and species losing their refugia. In some, we must create refugia for all species, places for all of us, and all of us meaning all of the birds and animals and every single creature and species and insect to live together. That's what it matters. In all these examples, again, there are deep correlations with the land. The landscapes shape who they are and the ways they resist and re-exist. This deep relation with the land are the different forms of horizontal solidarity, my friends. Humans with other humans, more than humans, beings, others, all on the plane of immanences, with trees and with the topsoil and so on and so forth. However, Even these alternative movements of fugue are endangered. There are only 20% of forests standing on the earth right now. So to protect the forest is to keep refugia for people, animals, creatures, all lives, all forms of life. So in order to do that, we also need to dream, my friends. Dreams with trees and water, insects, animals, coral reefs, bees, pollinators, seeds, soil. As Tennyson says, the alternative forms of marooning fugue begins with the dream-like scapes invoked by Fanon, with the I Have a Dream chanted by Martin Luther King, with his liberations in and through the imaginary. To stop dreaming is to be caught up by the always awakened eyes of capitalism that never sleeps. Their motto is, come back to earth, stop dreaming. That's the order of things. What do you want to change? But we say, no, demon who wants me to get away from my dream, step back right now. May we then, Christians, create ceremonies to cast out the demons. And I'll say, demon of possession of the land, get away from me. Demon of progress, get away from me. Demon of Christian frameworks alone, get away from me. Demons of human thinking about just humans and human alone, get away from me. Demons of concerns that doesn't take the earth as fundamental to our living, get away from me. Demon of inclusion and fixing the system, get away from me. Demons of thinking and no rituals with the land and its protocols and care, get away from me. Demons of destruction and extractivism, get away from me. And we all call, after that, we call upon the Spirit to create solidarity as forms of refugia. May we learn that we can only survive if in true and intense commitment and collaborative work and play with other Terrans, flourishing for rich multi-species assemblages that include people will be possible, as Donna Haraway says. Let us learn to step gentle on the land, to pay attention to every single form of life, to go slow, to learn that this has been here for millennia, and I need to learn. And that's my theological work. And I suggest, my friends, a song for us to sing. And it goes like this. I hope that we become like a bee. And here's the song for you to finish. I wanted to be like a bee in a beehive, flying around the flowers, pollinating the fields. I wanted to be like a honey bee, like being sweetness to the world, offering kindness and love. I wanted to be strong. I wanted to be true. I wanted to be loving. I wanted to shine. I wanted to be like a thunder in the sky, like a flying of a butterfly, like a bee in a beehive. I wanted to be